On January 17, 1912, a photograph was taken at the South Pole. In the picture, you can spot the flag of Norway, but the people captured aren't Norwegians. They're members of a British expedition who just discovered that their rivals had beaten them to conquering the South Pole. Imagine their despair after a grueling 79-day campaign. Scott, the leader, wrote in his diary about their disappointment, but the story doesn't end there. Let's delve deeper into what happened next. The race to arrive at the South Pole in 1909 was a turning point in human history. The Americans had no rivalry with the British for the Arctic, but they were more inclined to go north. Hence, Captain Robert Scott, a British man, had an advantage with his Terra Nova voyage that was ahead of the rest. Scott was going to take his time with the preparation, spending 3 years of study before aiming for the pole. However, Roald Amundsen from Norway was the one to shake things up a bit. He heard that the North Pole was reached, so he decided to head to Antarctica to be the first man to reach the South Pole. On 19th of February 1911, he sailed his ship Fram in secret to Antarctica. Amundsen even pitched his tent near the Scots' camp where they were going to start. Scott was certain Amundsen's plan was a very dangerous rival, and thus the contest for the South Pole started. In the preface to his memoirs, one of the members of the Terra Nova expedition later said something like this: "If you are into scientific research, then you should choose Scott. If you are looking for a fast and effective way, then Amundsen is the one for you. However, in times of trouble, do not hesitate to pray for Shackleton." They did this to indicate that they could see what was good in each explorer. Scott was famous for his keen interest in science, while Amundsen was the one who wanted to be fast and effective, and it is Shackleton who was the savior when all hope seemed lost. Scott's abilities were not only in the realm of exploration, but also in writing. His diary was what demonstrated his literary abilities. It is that which made him a hero figure against the sadness that followed his death. In contrast, Amundsen was the one who was more focused on the outcome. He was rather quiet and didn't seem to express himself very much. He was the type of person who considered every adventure as the consequence of having insufficient plans. Scott was the captain of a huge 65-strong fleet, which was a very big thing in those days. It was the Terra Nova ship with its 12 scientists and the photographer-cinematographer Herbert Ponting who were on board. However, from the whole group, only 5 did actually manage to reach the top. Captain Scott composed his team from a cavalryman, Oates, a scientist Wilson, a superintendent Evans, and a sailor Bowers, who became the last member of the crew. A few experts argue that this hasty decision was a lethal mistake, as there was only enough food and equipment for 4 people. However, Amundsen's team was very well coordinated and prepared for any difficulty. The leader and 8 other men, who were all strong and skilled, landed in Antarctica with him. They were proficient in skiing, navigation, and driving the dogs. None of the other 2 had any experience in polar exploration, and only 5 of them, the best among them, reached the pole. Amundsen made a smart move by taking a champion skier as a lead runner. He also acquired knowledge of the Eskimos' methods of withstanding severe cold and ensured that his men wore fur outfits like anoraks and fur boots. He was convinced that the absence of fur clothing would make any expedition unfit for the journey. However, Scott's expedition was more scientific and progressive, and they did not use the information that the natives had. They wore British wool and rubberized fabrics too. With recent research, including wind tunnel tests, the role of each clothing type was not defined. Amundsen's transportation was both efficient and inhumane. They had 52 Greenland husky dogs at the beginning, drawing 4 heavy sleds of food and equipment. In the course of the trip, their dogs were eaten, thus making the sleds lighter. At the final count, only 11 dogs returned to the base camp. Scott's plan was more complicated. To help him in the journey, he invented self-motorized sleds, Mongolian ponies, and some Siberian huskies as backup. At some point, they were forced to pull the sleds themselves. This plan was destined to fail from the moment it began. The sleds were broken down in no time, the ponies were weakened by the cold, and there were not enough huskies to last for the whole trip. Scott and his men dragged the supplies on sleds by means of shoulder harnesses, each of them carrying a hefty load. Scott maintained that this way of doing things was more effective than the British tradition where the explorer had to achieve the goal on their own. On the other hand, that resulted in their suffering and hunger. The sleds themselves dragged them further and ate their calories, and they couldn't carry enough food. Amundsen's success was based on his efficient use of dogs, which was the key to his success, while Scott's dependence on human strength and tradition proved to be his downfall. The malnutrition was another factor that greatly influenced the result of the exploration. The Norwegian team had biscuits made of wholemeal flour, oats, and yeast, and these biscuits provided them with the essential nutrients. As for the British, their biscuits were made mostly of wheat flour. As a result, Scott's crew was affected by scurvy and nervous disorders due to the lack of vitamin B. They had no food to eat on the way back and not enough strength to reach the nearest warehouse. Unlike the Norwegians, who throw out the extra food to reduce the weight on their back, the Norwegian base was 1,380 kilometers away from the pole, and it took Amundsen's party 56 days to cover this distance. The sled dogs pulled over 1.5 tons of supplies, and there were backup supplies for the return trip. On December 14, 1911, they reached the South Pole and erected a tent which they named Polheim, which in Norwegian means home of the pole. In the tent there was a letter for King Haakon VII of Norway and a note from Amundsen asking Scott to deliver the letter if they didn't return. On the way back, Amundsen's team was faster again, taking 43 days to get back to the base camp. 1 month later, the British were able to find the tent, having traveled 1,500 kilometers in 79 days. It is a great disenchantment, and I am very sorry for my faithful companions. All the daydreams must go. It will be a tiresome return, Scott wrote in his diary, describing the difficulties they had to overcome. Exhausted, hungry, and unwell, Scott and his 2 remaining comrades embarked on the long journey to the coast. After another 71 days of struggle, they died of starvation in a tent which was not more than 40 kilometers away from the next supply station. By the end of 1912, the tent of Scott, Wilson, and Bowers was found by the crew of the Terra Nova expedition, together with the letter of Amundsen to the King of Norway. The last letters and notes they wrote were discovered with them. When Scott's diaries were released, the team of Norwegians was counterattacked in Britain. While they were not bold enough to point a finger at Amundsen as the one who had caused Scott's death, they still felt the national pride that made it impossible to give in without a fight. Nevertheless, Scott's genius as a writer brought about the tale of noble sacrifice instead of the ruthlessness which the Norwegians were thought to be. The success of the Norwegian sailors was attributed to their unexpected arrival in Antarctica, which disrupted the British expedition's plans, and to their decision to consume their sled dogs for sustenance. The deaths of the gentlemen in Scott's crew, who were assumed to be stronger both physically and mentally, were viewed as a tragic accident. It wasn't until the latter half of the 20th century that both expeditions' tactics were critically examined. In 2006, a realistic experiment conducted in Greenland tested the equipment and nutrition used by both crews. Unfortunately, the British explorers' physical condition was so poor that doctors insisted on evacuating them, highlighting the challenges they faced even in a controlled setting.